You may have heard of the idea of women in Japan speaking differently in a way that's very nice, polite, indirect, very gentle. Sometimes it's even called women's language. Now, in reality, this thing that's called Japanese women's language is kind of a parallel to gender stereotypes elsewhere. There are stereotypes about gender differences in speech in American English. They're about as real. They're the same kind of thing. In an article by Okamoto, the author concludes that Japanese women's language is not a style of speaking that Japanese women have long been using over the centuries, but an ideological construct consisting of a set of norms, knowledge, and values. From what I hear in Japanese language classes here in the United States, the idea of women's language is taught as fact. This is how women speak. But it is an ideology, not a fact of how people actually speak necessarily. So, for people who have not studied Japanese, just a little bit of context. This is not only about how what gender differences are expected in speech patterns, but in Japanese in general, there is an elaborate system of polite expressions, so-called honorifics. And one of the approaches for creating polite expressions is to exalt the honored person, the other person, by using an honorific form. Here are some examples. So, just to say drink, you might choose from two different forms or an additional number of forms. To say expensive or to say wife, there can be quite a difference in what the linguistic form is. And this is, again, a way of being polite by exalting the other person. Other than exalt the other person to put the other person in a higher position, another approach could be to depreciate someone else so that by comparison, the honored person sounds better. These are other forms that accomplish that. And beautification honorifics show the speaker's refinement. So to say beer, you can choose from at least two different forms for this purpose. And in addition, these various honorifics from these three approaches can be combined. So we don't have anything exactly like this in English. This is an elaborate system, but just to give you an idea of the same, approximately the same sort of thing, we do have different stylistic levels in vocabulary in English. So to say food, potato, stay, and use, this is ordinary. Then kind of on the lower stylistic level, you could call food grub and you could call a potato a spud. This would take it down a notch. Or to be fancy, you could call food hors d'oeuvre, or instead of stay, say remain. Instead of use, say utilize or employ. So clearly, this isn't as complex as the system in Japanese, but socially, it's for a similar purpose, roughly speaking. In the article by Okamoto that we referred to, she has some key conclusions. In Japan, gentleness and refinement are valued in normative femininity. So it's certainly very true that the idea of femininity being gentle and refined is prevalent. This is not the same thing as saying women actually are like this. Certainly not saying women are like this by nature. So in reality, Japanese women do not necessarily use feminine speech. When they do, they use it as a resource for constructing their identities.